Donovan is, interesting.
You keep smiling at me like that, I'm gonna throw you across this table.
Not gonna happen, Trent.
You're lonely, Chad.
I'm preoccupied.
A symptom.
So why are you still on the prowl, man?
It's in my nature.
But you're engaged.
I'm a cop, not a eunuch.
You have changed in almost every way. Almost. Scratch.
Do I make you uncomfortable?
Confused.
Well, at least I don't lie about it.
I want to get married, man.
It's forever.
Do you mind elaborating?
I don't know how else to put it.
Am I supposed to take this literally? Because if I am, then we are having a very different conversation.
I'm telling you the only way I know how to.
Why didn't you go to the police?
And that should be obvious.
You do understand the law.
Do what you have to do.
All right, let's backtrack for a minute, okay? You're 24, and you've only been in a committed relationship with 2 men, both at the same time. How did that relationship begin?
We were drawn to each other. I once thought it was by circumstance. Now I know it was much more.
Were you open to 3-way relationships before this one?
Not at all. I used to believe that we're only meant for that one special person. The problem was figuring out who it was.
And now?
If it's said that love has no face, gender, or color, then I suppose we have to admit that it probably has no number.
Even in light of your recent events?
Even still.
So why did you come here today, Niquarterli?
I needed this to be written. I couldn't risk any misinterpretation. I saw your ad last night, and I knew it was a sign.
You have put me in a very awkward position.
I know you'll have to tell. I knew that coming in here.
Do you have any friends or family that can help support you through this?
I wouldn't be here.
I really don't want to be a part of this.
Neither do I.
This goes way beyond my book.
You wouldn't include it?
If everything that you are telling me is true, then including it would be highly unethical.
So massage it. Make it digestible.
I can't include it.
I thought you were trying to help people.
Not like this.
Help me.
I can't give you the help that you need.
I just need for people to know my side. To know why.
Then tell them.
I won't have time to.
So where would we start?
The beginning.
All right, then.
Are you patronizing me?
I am as sincere as you are.
How can I be sure you'll tell the truth?
By reading it,
I won't be able to do that.
then I guess you'll never know.
I didn't know things would go this far.
But they have.
I just needed them to know how I felt. I'd never felt so much pain.
Literally or figuratively.
Does it matter?
I'm just trying to be specific.
I killed them, Chadwick. Figuratively and literally.